Okay, so when I received the invitation last year, I was really delighted because I thought, wow, here is an opportunity with a group of people to talk about hope. There's so much to be despondent about. And not only that, a group of people who are interested in the evidence base for it, to be informed about hope, because there's a lot of false hope or pendling of hope around that is actually a bit of a masquerading for just the kind of onset of more despondency. But before I talk, I would like you to turn to a neighbor, preferably the one you know least, because some of you might have come in pairs, and to just share one image, not a long story, an image of what gives you hope. 3 examples. Who would like to share an example of their image of hope? Anybody? Greta Sundberg. Yes?
Every morning there's a sunrise, and every day is the chance of a beginning of something new, and gives you opportunity to do something new and hopefully positive.
Every morning there's a sunrise, and every day there's a new field of opportunities awaiting you. Beautiful. In the back? Imagination, new ideas, and enthusiasm. Well, no lack of that, hopefully, at this festival, particularly the new ideas. There's so much. Yes?
According to WaterAid, 90% of the world's people have now got access to clean water.
Evidence of change is a huge, huge source of hope, absolutely. So there's a swallow. When I was looking it up, a swallow is in ancient times is a sign of hope because it's the first bird that appears after winter. And it's this sign that there's life after a period of slumber. And so in a lot of the work that we do at Oxfam, we're confronted daily with a lot of bad news. Every Monday morning at the office, there's something called Stand Up. I sit in the campaigns team, and 150 of us stand up and we share what we're working on. Not everybody, but we kind of specialize. And it's one humanitarian crisis, or it's a tax evasion scheme, or it's terrible wages that supermarkets are paying to the suppliers of their food. There's lots and lots of awfulness that we're confronted with. And last year I got so fed up, I thought, come on, there has to be an evidence base for hope. Otherwise, why are we still here? Why don't we all just go home? And so what I want to share with you this morning is a little bit of what we're slowly starting to unpack as a series of very, very profound stories of evidence for hope, but also the need for hope. So bear with me while I first drag you through despair, okay? So just to give you a little insight into what gives me hope, not this system. There we go. Those are our 2 daughters. And they are just so enthusiastic about the possibility of change. And they say, well, of course we have to fight, we have to make things better. They're full of empathy, and with them, thousands and thousands of others. So I have to say the new generation give me a lot of hope. It's my generation that make me sometimes think, move on, please. Make space for the others. So, but hope can also, and hope is, this is just a strapline from The Guardian, but there's lots of straplines out there. Change is possible, hope is power. But is it? Because I think there's another side to hope, which is this side, and somebody mentioned Greta Thunberg. And this is a beautiful quote of hers where she rejects hope. I don't want your hope, I want you to act. I want you to act as if the house is on fire, because it is. So where are we on hope? I see it as a battlefield between optimists and pessimists. I have battles in academia with people who say, look at all the wonderful change. And then I look at the data that I have, and I'm like, oh my goodness, there's still so far to go. So really, it's a glass half full, glass half empty, and it doesn't seem to be much of a discussion between them. So I was quite keen to look at what the evidence base is for hope. But in the meantime, there's plenty to get down about. And I do want to actually talk about that because we can't be complacent. And I think that's what Greta Thunberg asks us to do, not just to have empty hope, but to have action and hope. So does anybody know what do you think is considered living below the poverty line? For those of you who know the answer, shush. Others have a guess. On a day, what would you need below which you're really considered poor? Shout, any number.
50 cents.
50 cents, okay. Sorry? $1.50? $1.50? Any others?
Enough to buy the essentials wherever you live.
Okay, it's a contextual measure. Yep. Okay, so $1.9 actually is the current measure that the World Bank and therefore the rest of the world uses to measure extreme poverty. And it's great news. 90% are less extreme compared to 1820. Yep. So if you look at that pink line, it's going down and down and down and down. And only that little slice at the bottom, this was in 2015, that's the number of people living on less than $1.9 a day. Personally, I think it's interesting, but it's not necessarily a party. Because what does $1.9 a day mean? In the UK, an economist here did a calculation and he said $1.9 a day is the equivalent of 35 British people living off of a minimum wage without being able to barter, share, loan, kind of harvest, or do anything. I would challenge any of us to do that. So it's not a real big achievement if you're in that bottom slice. Not only that, but there's about 750 million people still there, and the population is growing. So there is a huge swathe of people for whom this minimum, not to be proud about standard hasn't yet come home. If you use a standard like $7.4 a day, which is a calculation, again, globally, but I absolutely agree that it is contextual. If you use that, then there are more people living on less compared to 1981. Right? We have an increase in people who are not getting by on $7.4 a day. So metrics matters. When you celebrate, look behind the data and say, what is it actually showing you in terms of what it's counting and what it's valuing? This incredible arc, this incredible progress, and it still is a huge step forward because we now have, after the Millennium Development Goals, we've had the Sustainable Development Goals, and that's a global, collective set of agreements about what is acceptable. That's an incredible achievement in and of itself. But this is all based on an economy that has been largely extractive, and I'll try and speak a little bit about that economic base through a number of figures. The next graph I'm going to show might fill you with horror, but there's a very simple story behind it, so don't collapse just yet, okay? We are in the Anthropocene. You do not have to look at the numbers, okay, or the graphs. You don't have to be able to read it, but I'll unpack the story for you. We are in the Anthropocene. So the Anthropocene is the era that is known as where human beings are determining most of the impact and the changes on the natural environment, okay? The story is as follows. On the left-hand side, you see two lines going up, population and GDP, growth in demand, leading to the purple arcs going up, a growth in water use, a growth in land use, a growth in transportation use, growing, growing, growing. First, let's go to the good story. You have these beautiful dropping metrics of awfulness. So you have improved human well-being in the light blue ones. You have child mortality is the second one in the middle, in the top one. You have a huge decrease in extreme poverty. We've had that one. Malnutrition. You've got wonderful decreases. But the top part is the problem. The top part is the depletion. It's all based on an extraction that is finite. And so you have increasing kind of drawdown on all these resources that have an absolute max. And so the question for the future is, how can we hold on to and expand all these wonderful achievements, while not drawing down on the future? And I strongly recommend for next year people like Kate Rayworth, who speak about the donut economics, absolutely fascinating analysis, actually from Oxfam. And she developed a lot of her thinking about this crunch between what we want socially and this limit environmentally. So let's just look back, and then people say, okay, well, what should we be doing? We should tackle poverty over there. But actually, the Lancet has a much more sophisticated analysis of the underlying causes of all of this. And this is unfortunately my only animated slide, which I keep forgetting to fix. If they've called something a global syndemic, it's the convergence of three symptoms: unchallenged economic pursuit, it's just going on. Nobody is putting on the brakes yet. A very powerful commercial engine that is stimulating our consumption. And on top of that, weak political governance and capture by business that would be the place where you would expect the brakes to come from. So this is the Lancet who is talking about the core drivers of this problem that is leading to all these impacts. And in fact, population, people say, well, what about population increase? Tiny part of the problem at the moment, because it's not the bulk of the population that is drawing down all the resources. And this leads then, this is my only other slide, I apologize. And then the effects are, of course, you have urban growth, consumption demand, fossil fuels, a lot of industry that's drawing down. The scale of human use of the earth is unprecedented. We're using 1.7 Earths at the moment, and of course it's not sustainable. So when people say how wonderful it is, I say, but for how long? Okay? So, going on a little bit, the people who are impacted, of course, are those who are directly dependent on the environment, who need it to just live. Urban people, often those in slums who have not found it possible to stay in rural areas, and then everyone eventually. I haven't seen analyses yet of coronavirus in relation to the climate, but we were driving in yesterday and we saw this flooding that's been quite recent and quite impressive flooding. My husband in the back there, he's from Australia. We've had entire tracts of areas where we used to walk, completely gone. Friends have had their houses burnt down. But it's still not the great equalizer, because let's take a look at where food production will be affected. It's not where we are. The red areas are where there will be a huge decrease of food production. The green areas will probably see an increase. And so impacts are kind of layered and layered on people who already have the least. Okay, moving on to the economy. So if you have so little, what do? You get a job. But jobs are really problematic for a lot of people. And again, this is going to be another slightly complicated diagram perhaps, but there's again a fairly simple story behind it. As you have globalization and skills and technology changes leading increasingly to replacement, demand for low-skilled workers is going down, and there's competition for fewer jobs, and you end up with a push down on wages for lower skills. That's the top circle on your left. So you have increasing inequality because of that downward push on wages for the low skill. You also have, because of the power imbalances between different groups of workers, negotiation around labor rights and around income is also, we've all seen that trade unions have, the power of trade unions really is waning. So what are other ways to get to basics? So wages again are being pushed down. And then there's discrimination. For some groups, women, ethnic minorities, wages are further pushed down. So you have a real downward trend on those employment opportunities where people would hope to get out of their poverty curve. I'm going to skip forward to actually this one. Okay, inequality. Oxfam gets a lot of flack for working on inequality. They say, you should be working on poverty. But inequality is absolutely central to poverty. So this is an analysis by the World Bank, and it takes a look at 5 different trajectories, under which the top line is where you have rising inequality. That's the kind of orange line for those of you who aren't colorblind like my husband. The top line is rising inequality, and the world is on track for inequality to increase. The bottom green line is where you actively intervene to reduce inequality. where you redistribute and you get more taxes in order to invest them, for example, in public services. That public services are a huge equalizer for people in terms of their poverty status. It's only for those two scenarios at the bottom, the orange line and the light green line, that we will be able to achieve what we have said that by 2030, which is that there will only be 3% of the world's population below the extreme poverty line. So we have to work on inequality in order to get people out of poverty. It's not an either or, it's not a nice to have. Okay, I've been talking about people in general so far, but we're a very diverse lot. The poverty cycle is deeply gendered, okay? So you have the patriarchal system of control that intersects with harmful social norms, that intersects with some of these economic manifestations that reduce public services available for people who need them a lot. And what you have is not just an income deprivation for women, but and we know that the gender pay gap is still phenomenally alive and kicking. You have deprivation in health, education, nutrition, but also time poverty. And time poverty is increasingly something that we're working on. If you give a woman an opportunity to have a job, but she doesn't have the time to actually take the job, what use is that job? You've got to tackle the time she spends on care, which is not negotiable. So we're working on trying to figure out those imbalances. So poverty cycle is very gendered. It doesn't affect everybody. Here, again, a graph in which I want you just to look at those two, those kind of vertical red arrows. We've seen enormous progress in gender parity in education. So we're almost at girls going to school at the same rate as boys. Fantastic. It is not translating into jobs. So the first long line is Northern Africa and Western Asia, where the blue line is the number of women who are getting into employment, slight increase, and men, 93. You won't be able to read it from where you are. A huge gap. Going a bit more to the right, Central and Southern Asia, it's actually dropping, women coming out of employment, with men staying the same, and a big gap. And for the world as a whole, it is on the decrease. So this is a huge issue to tackle. We can't be complacent. And jobs are important for a lot of reasons. So there's massive gaps. If you don't have jobs, do you have access to land? No. Less than 20% of women own agricultural land in sub-Saharan Africa. Can you bank, perhaps? Poor women, 28% less likely than men to have a bank account. Fiscal inclusion is a big topic with a lot of action, so I'm hopeful that we'll get there. Half of women have much less access to internet. Internet is the zone now where business transactions, information about farming decisions, connections are happening, much less access. And women need their income because so many have to have the choice to leave the household. 1 in 5 women globally experience domestic intimate partner violence. There's enormous variation there. It's about 6%, I believe, in Europe and 40% in Oceania. So these global averages are, distorting, but it's a very important factor. You have to have the option to opt out. This week, I don't know if you noticed it, but UNDP came out with a social norms analysis. Harmful social norms deeply limit women's ability to then influence all these things I've been talking about through politics or economic life. And you can see the line, it's going down. There's less and less progress. There's regression on gender inequality. Fewer women in parliament, fewer women in businesses. And the chart on the right is very fascinating. I know you can't see the details, but just look at the tiny little sliver of blue and the large block of red. This was a study done. Only 14% of women and 10% of men worldwide have no gender social norms bias. So as long as we believe that women have men have more right to education than women, that men have more right to a job, that they will make better politicians, it's going to be very, very hard to get women on par with men. So these social norms are absolutely critical. We started at about 15:15.
It's absolutely fine.
It's fine, okay. All right. So if these rights, if these opportunities are not available to people, what do they have? They have the right to protest. They have the right, they have the Greta Thunberg right. They have the right to demand a difference. So that requires there to be political and civic freedoms in order to deal with rising inequality, in order to deal with the voice of civil society. These freedoms are essential to overcome poverty. People's freedoms need to be, are the pushers to get their human rights, and in order to do that, you have to have civic space. You have to, this would not be possible, what we're doing now, informing ourselves, connecting, if there was no political freedom and civic freedom in the UK. Thankfully there is. However, globally, only 17% of people live in politically relatively open societies. And there's been a net decline of freedoms. So 116 countries have seen a net decline in freedoms, with 63 experiencing improvement. So it's very fluctuating. I think a lot of the headlines show this phenomenon. One government in, great, other government in, terrible. But it's a problem if you can't assert your rights. And then finally, to really make us all think, oh, let's just go home. This is worse if you're in a place of conflict. I've been talking about the good places. So for the 4th year in a row, there's been a drop in peacefulness. 60% of all conflicts recur because there's not an investment in the foundation of peace and in the conditions of basic services or basic needs that people have. I was horrified when I joined Oxfam about 4 years ago to realize that a refugee camp on average lasts 17 years. These are cities. These are towns that aren't invested in like that. They're not there temporarily. Of the 13 largest food crises in the world, and you remember the map that I showed you about the increase and decrease of food production? That's not going to go away. 10 were conflict related. So conflict and absence and scarcity of food, very intertwined. Okay, so what's looming? This is the despairing part. This is why we need hope, why we need action, because there's still so much to do. We can't be complacent. One of the problems is that the people with the least are going to be in the places that are going to get worse. And so you have a conflation of challenges. I've done some work on what are the trends we're looking at, and here's some work from the OECD. On the left-hand side, you're seeing 3 concentric circles from 2016. And the extremely fragile contexts, the people living in extremely fragile contexts is the dark brown. That's less than the people in the other fragile, that's the kind of lighter, and then the rest of the world is actually the lightest, right? So you can see that here we have, probably now we have about 20% of the people living in the extremely fragile states. But this is going to really explode. So the other fragile areas is going to increase by 2030 to about 55% of the world's population. So these are going to be people who are having to deal with the volatility and the unknowns, possibly conflict, deficiencies of some kind. So how are we dealing with that? And the extreme poor living in these fragile contexts will increase to about 83% of the extreme poor, right? So the extreme poor, there's a lot of extreme poor not living in fragile contexts, but most of them will be living in these fragile contexts. So one of the things so this is all past data, right? And one of the problems that we have in the world we live in, it's a VUCA world, by the way, there's an acronym for it, VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. I learned that recently, acronym for everything. Is we have to really think forward in order to be able to anticipate what is coming down the road. We will never know the scale and the place and the rate of change, but that change is happening, is inevitable. So we've looked at some analyses of these megatrends, And megatrends are large transformative processes that will affect everybody. This is online for people who want it, by the way. You just look up my name in Megatrends. Rapid technological development with lots of promise and lots of problems. There's a really, in the paper we unpack where some of these positive and negative perspectives come from. And for example, with technology, it's absolutely going to benefit those who already have the most. Inequality is guaranteed to increase at the current rates with this rapid development. Demography, I'll come back to that in a sec. Environmental pressures, I've talked about that, and shifting power. Europe, the US are no longer the center. It's China, it's South Asia. That's where decisions are made that will impact absolutely and are impacting absolutely everybody. Okay, I want to actually focus a little bit on hope now. I can feel the spirits are down. So the question I asked myself a while back was, is there any evidence for hope? And evidence for hope a bit rigorously, not just, oh, there's a nice little case study and a nice little cooperative, or we have a lot of stories of initiating activities in Oxfam. And I'm like, okay, yet another little group, great, but what does it add up to? Where do you get to some kind of change at scale? And where do you get to change at scale? In the hard places. It's easy when you've got a government and you've got taxpayers and you've got budgets, but not always. So the big question is, what evidence is there that the structural causes of poverty, so not social nets that, here's some money because you've missed out on the opportunity that somebody else had, but what are the structural causes of poverty? Can they be tackled quickly in some of these difficult places, and what can it show us? So I'm going to speak through 3 very short examples, and it's to try and expand. I was really fascinated when my colleagues kind of pulled these together. I was like, oh, I'd never really thought about that as an option. A cable car in Medellin. So this is in Colombia. This was a very simple but complicated in terms of collaboration effort in Colombia to try and improve the access of about 700,000 people slapped on with steep hills of Medellin and giving them access to the center of the city. Without that, every trip was an hour. If you don't have that time, remember time poverty? That's no use. There's some simple cable cars that have been put in place, all based on hydroelectric power, lowering carbon emissions and congestion, and it has, in some cases, tripled incomes to women. That is phenomenal in a very short period of time. It's given them access to public services, because you can bet there's no doctors or schools slapped on that hill, and that is the future. And it has also reduced stigmatization. They're now proud to live in these slums, in what were really considered really backward areas, because there's more investment, it's seen as the future coming into that particular neighborhood. A very different example. I talked about social norms. Everybody has to be involved in this. There's a fascinating organization called Pro Mundo, working in 50 countries with 100 organizations, saying, guys, step up. Because it's only when you make the difference that everybody will benefit. And this is just one of the examples from MenCare in Rwanda. They were basically doing training and support, drawing men into discussions on childcare, drawing men into discussions on sexual and reproductive health, having conversations, men amongst men, about domestic violence. And they've done a randomized control trial recently, and it has noticeably, I was looking at some of the data, only a quarter of the domestic violence that there was before, for example. They contribute to childcare, they open up women's time, women can go and get employment, decision-making is much more shared. These are hope-giving, and it's like this benign virus, not the coronavirus, but a very benign virus in these countries, because the concentration is with 6,500 men, but the messages are reaching millions. And then finally, one that might be familiar to some of you, fair trade. When I was deciding whether to include this in our case, I thought, oh gosh, another little social enterprise, and it's benefiting 30. But 1 + 1 + 1 is a lot. So the World Fair Trade Organization is a membership organization that now unites more than 360 social enterprises, and they are supporting the livelihoods of a million people, 74% of whom are women. And what's interesting is that because they're social enterprises, you're not just getting the income aspect of the benefit, you're getting the destigmatization, you're getting the connection, you're getting the community that grows out of these ways of working. And they're much more solid, 4 times less likely to go bankrupt, because there's this support system making it all happen. So these are 3 examples, and there's kind of closing on a number of lessons. One of the things that I was struck by is how all of these cases, we've got about 24 now, they're quite in-depth. They were remarkably hard to find because we set very high criteria. It's easy to get little examples, but it's quite hard to get examples that really look at these systemic drivers of poverty. Is the shift to co-benefits. Every single initiative tackled and climate and extreme economic inequality and gender. It's not just one thing. It is possible to do it all, but it's got to be very deliberate. There's various strategies to get to scale. So one of the things that I found interesting was that unless you're intentional about getting to scale, it's not going to happen. So there's verticals, what they call vertical strategies, which is when national governments or corporations or big institutions take something and just deliver it at scale. So when you change government practices, such as gender-responsive budgeting or fair wages in factories, or just the Medellin cable cars, just extending what is everybody's right into these other areas. And then horizontal, like the World Fair Trade, it's that benign virus, just replicating more and more and more. But you've got to invest in that. So, coming to an end now, I'll close with this one. So it is possible. I'm very confident seeing all of these wonderful stories, and they're all recent stories. We weren't interested in abolition of slavery, which, by the way, hasn't happened. There's still 46 million slaves in the world. But we're really, what has happened recently on these issues? And it really is these 10 things, which I won't read out, but I can certainly leave, if people are interested, I can certainly share this PowerPoint with them. It is about strengthening skills. It is about that political space I was talking about. It is about lobbying for legislation change and policies and practices in corporations. And that's where I will leave it. The world for some is better. The world for many is terrible. The world for all can be a lot better, and there's so much to learn from the evidence for hope, not just wishing. Over to you.